All right, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens, and this is the San Francisco Dharma Collective. And tonight we're going to read a new sutta. So if you are new to Dharma Doors, every Sunday night we get together and we read and talk about Buddhist suttas. For the last many months, maybe even years now, we've been making our way through the Majjhima Nikāya, the Middle Length Discourses of the Buddha. And we've made it all the way through these, and we're way in the back now to Sutta number 104 tonight. This is the Sāmagāma Sutta. Sāmagāma is a place. This is the sutta that the Buddha taught at Sāmagāma. If you've been coming to Dharma Doors, you know that all of these suttas, originally they didn't have titles. There wasn't like a Barnes and Noble where you could go get these, so they didn't have titles. So over time, the suttas, they came to have titles of either where the sutta took place, who the Buddha is talking to, or maybe the topic. So, um, so tonight we are going to dive deep into this Sāmagāma Sutta. Really quickly, though, I want to remind everybody that we are in this little section that started a few weeks ago, and we are on the fourth of 10 suttas that are grouped together. And the very, very first sutta was the Devadaha Sutta. And I want to quickly remind you that the Devadaha Sutta, it was the Buddha talking about what he teaches versus what the Nigantas teach. And I'm mentioning this because the Nigantas are going to pop up again in the sutta tonight. So the Nigantas were a different religious group. You know them as the Jain tradition or the Jain tradition, if you've ever heard of that. The Nigantas are the Jains or the modern day Jains. And we're actually going to be hearing about the founder of the Jains, the Niganta called Nataputra. But Nataputra is usually referred to as Mahavira, who is like the founder of the Jain tradition. So in the Devadaha Sutta a number of weeks ago, the Buddha was describing what he teaches versus what the Jains teach or what the Nigantas teach. And just to summarize really quickly, the Nigantas, like many religious traditions, the Nigantas were promising that the results of practice are experienced in the future, like in a future life or a future rebirth, a better situation. And the Buddha said, yeah, what I'm teaching is available right here, right now. It's not about the future. So that was like a major difference that the Buddha was illustrating between the Nigantas and what the Buddha was teaching. So this kind of introduced the subject or the topic of drishtis, of views, different religious views or different worldviews in that way. That leads us to the second sutta in this collection of 10, and this was the 5 and the 3. And we spent many weeks on that sutta because it was actually all about different worldviews and describing the Buddhist kind of lack of a view, perhaps. So that was that sutta, and that continued this topic of different worldviews. And then last week, we did a little sutta called the Kinti Sutta. And this is where the Buddha was describing, well, it was a few different things, but in one part, he's talking about why he even teaches, the Dharma, which is interesting. And we spent a lot of time on that last week. But I want to remind you that one of the big things that came out of the sutta last week, it was a really, really simple way to think about Buddhism, actually. It was just a really simple way to think about the practice of Buddhism and like what all of this is about. And what it is that last week we looked at the idea of arguing or disputing, contest, being, just being contrary. And what the sutra was about last time is about how if you want to know what the real teachings of the Buddha, like what is the real teaching? It's about not arguing. That's it. That's actually it. And what's interesting about it is if you really start to look underneath the desire to argue, you will learn a lot in that way. And so what I mean is don't argue, but look at why you would be inclined to do that. Ask yourself, for example, what do you expect to gain from this? These things are important to ask in that way of like, why would I even, like, if, somebody says something and you're thinking, that's wrong. I should assert my opinion and let them know what is right. What's going to happen? You really think you're going to change their mind? Is somebody going to change your mind? So what we wanted to look at from last week was just the impetus to argue, contest, to dispute. I'm kind of reiterating this and reinforcing this because the topic of disputes is going to be the topic tonight. And I just wanted us to notice that, oh, the Buddha already started talking about this last week. And that if you really want to understand the practice of Buddhism at a very basic level, it's about not arguing and fighting, period. So that's going to be our topic. Let's dive into the sutta tonight. So once again, we're in the Majjhima Nikāya. We're over on page 853 of the Wisdom publication tradition, or publication, I should say. And this is the teaching the Buddha gave at Sāmagāma. So, thus have I heard, on one occasion, the Blessed One, the Buddha, was living in the Sakyan country of Sāmagāma. Now, on that occasion, the Niganta Nataputra, the leader of the Jains, had just died at Pava. On his death, the Nigantas divided. They split into two. And they had taken to quarreling and brawling and were deep in disputes, stabbing each other with verbal daggers. You don't understand the Dharma and the discipline. I understand the Dharma and the discipline. I understand this Dharma and discipline. How could you understand this Dharma and this discipline? Your way's wrong. My way's right. I'm consistent. You're inconsistent. What should have been said first, you said it last. And what should have been said last, you said first. What you had so carefully thought up has been turned upside down. Your assertions have been shown up. You're refuted. Go and learn better. Or disentangle yourself from this if you can. So those were the verbal daggers that the Nigantas were flying at each other. It seemed as if there were nothing but slaughter among the Niganta Nataputa's pupils as they were or as they were his badly proclaimed and badly expounded disciples in that way. which was unemancipating. It was not conducive to peace, expounding by one not fully enlightened, and was now with its shrine broken, left without a refuge. So after the Nigantha Nataputra died, it all started to fall apart. Then the Buddhist student, the novice, Chunda, who actually is Shariputra's younger brother, if you know about Shariputra, this is his younger brother. So Chunda, who had spent the rainy season retreat at Pava, where the Nigantha Nataputra died, Chunda went to the Venerable Ananda, and after paying homage to him, he sat down at one side, and he told him what was taking place with the Nigantas. The Venerable Ananda then said to the novice Chunda, "Friend Chunda, this is news that should be told to the Blessed One. Come, let us approach the Buddha and tell him about this." "Yes, Venerable Sir," the novice Chunda replied. Then the Venerable Ananda and the novice Chunda together went to the Blessed One. After paying homage to him, they sat down at one side, and the Venerable One said to the Blessed One, "This novice Chunda, Venerable Sir, says that, Venerable Sir, the Nigantha Nataputra has just died, and on his death the Niganthas are divided, split in two, and is now with its shrine broken. They are left without a refuge." And now Ananda says, "And I thought, Venerable Sir, let not a dispute arise in the Sangha when the Blessed One has gone. For such a dispute would be for the harm and unhappiness of many, for the loss, harm, and suffering of gods and humans alike." And the Buddha says, "What do you think, Ananda? These things that I have taught you, after directly knowing them myself, that is, the four foundations of mindfulness, the four kinds of right striving, the four bases of spiritual power, the five faculties, the five powers, seven factors of enlightenment, and the Noble Eightfold Path. Do you see, Ananda? Do you see even two bhikkhus who make differing assertions about these 37 aids to awakening?" So if you weren't here last week, just want you to know, last week this topic came up, this list of the four foundations of mindfulness, four right efforts, all the way up to the Eightfold Path. So this list of lists appeared in last week's sutra, and I did a whole Dharma talk. I actually went through all 37, so we're not going to do it tonight. Just want you to know that it's kind of being repeated here. And the Buddha's saying, what do you think, Ananda? Based upon the basics of what I have taught, the 37 aids, do you see any bhikkhus arguing about that? "No, Venerable Sir. I do not see even two bhikkhus who make differing assertions about these things." "But, Venerable Sir, there are people who live deferential towards you, towards the Buddha, towards the Blessed One, who might, when he has gone, when he has passed away, they might create a dispute in the Sangha about livelihood and about the patimokkha or the pratimoksha. Such a dispute would be for the harm and unhappiness of many, for the loss, harm, and suffering of gods and humans." So really quickly, because this is a term we haven't encountered at least for a while, so let me clarify. So the Buddha is making a distinction here between the Dharma, which is the 37 aids of awakening, for example. Those are like the teachings. And he's making a distinction between that and livelihood and what is called the pratimoksha. And I just want to share with everybody what the pratimoksha is. If you've never heard of this, as a student of Buddhism, you should know about it in that way. So I really quickly want to mention, because it's going to come up in the sutta tonight, as you may know, the entire body of Buddhist literature, like all of the teachings of the Buddha, are divided into these three categories. The sutras, which is what we read every Sunday night, the Vinaya, sometimes pronounced Vinaya, but Vinaya, and that's all of the monastic rules, like all of the precepts, all of the discipline. And then there's a third category of teachings known as the Abhidharma. The Abhidharma is basically this, and let me explain it to you super simply, super quickly. If you read all of the sutras, if you read all the teachings of the Buddha as found like in these collections, the Buddha teaches a bunch of different stuff. Four Noble Truths, Four Foundations of Mindfulness, this and that, all over the place. So each sutra, the Buddha's teaching different stuff. Well, at a certain point, all of that Dharma, all of that teaching, was kind of brought together into like a system. And the Buddha doesn't do that in the sutras. The Buddha teaches all the different things. So at a certain point, and maybe this happened during the life of the Buddha, maybe it happened after, who knows? But at a certain point, all of the Dharma teachings of the Buddha from the sutras were kind of systematized into all of these lists and lists of lists and things like that. So the Abhidharma is sort of like a distillation of the Dharma teachings from the sutras. Everybody with me on that? Well, there's this other body of literature called the Vinaya. And we don't talk a lot about the Vinaya or the Vinaya because, well, we're not monastics, and it's all about being a good monk or a good nun and all of the rules for that. So I don't talk a lot about it. But what I want you to know, because you might not know this, the Vinaya, it's also hundreds and hundreds of different teachings of the Buddha. And you would think it's a sutra. You would think all of them are sutras because what the Vinaya is all of these different stories about a situation and a situation going badly, and then people going to the Buddha and saying, Buddha, what should we do? So-and-so's doing whatever, or so-and-so did whatever. What should we do? And the Buddha would say, oh, well, that's against the rules. And if somebody breaks that rule, you should do this. You should maybe sequester that person away from the Sangha for a week or 2 weeks. Usually, removing people from the group for a while is the primary punishment. But my point is that the Vinaya it's a big, big, big body of literature where every single rule that the Buddha ever gave, the entire backstory for the rule is given. Well, what happens is that eventually the Vinaya, is distilled down where they pull out just the rules. They leave the story in the Vinaya, but they pull out, but what did he say? Like, what is the rule? Oh, and so once you take every single rule out of the Vinaya, that's the Pratimoksha, or here it's called in Pali, the Patimokkha. So the pratimoksha is just the list of rules that comes from the Vinaya. And if you're really familiar with Buddhism, you may know that it is part of the tradition that on the new moon and the full moon, so twice a month at the beginning and midway through the month, it is customary for Buddhist groups like monasteries and temples for the practitioners to all get together and recite the pratimoksha. So that was a long way of explaining this, but it's going to come back. There's a reason why I needed you to know all of that. So the Abhidharma is to the sutras as the pratimoksha is to the Vinaya. Okay. Now, livelihood, really quickly, by the way, ajiva, the promotion of life or livelihood, that's about how do you feed yourself every day? And there are a lot of minutia of Buddhist rules around begging for food and livelihood, like things about how you're supposed to eat, when you're supposed to eat, what you're supposed to eat, all kinds of stuff. So the ideas of livelihood and pratimoksha, they go hand in hand. So Ananda's concerned that he's saying, well, you're still with us, like you're still here. And because everybody respects you and is deferential towards you, yeah, nobody's arguing now. But Ananda says, but after you pass away, there might be disputes about livelihood, which from history we know that's one of the primary things that the Sangha was debating about was livelihood. So Ananda says, but what if people start arguing and there's a dispute about livelihood and about the rules? Such a dispute would be a great harm for a lot of people. But the Buddha replies and says, a dispute about livelihood and about the pratimoksha rules, that would be trifling. That would be minor. Ananda. But should a dispute arise in the Sangha about the path or the way, such a dispute would be for the harm and unhappiness of many, for the loss, harm, and suffering of gods and humans. So the Buddha says, yeah, people are probably going to fight about that stuff, but that's nothing compared to people disputing and arguing about the Dharma itself, about the path and about well, they translate it as the way in here. Yeah. So, but should a dispute arise in the Sangha about the marga, so about the path, which is basically the Eightfold Noble Path, but it's also about an argument about the way to enlightenment. And then what is being translated as the way, which is a very strange translation. It's very, if it was a translation from Chinese, we would expect such language. What's being translated as the way is samapatti or pratipatti, accomplishment, basically the idea of enlightenment or nirvana. And the Buddha's saying if people start arguing about what enlightenment is or the path to get there, then we have a problem. If they're arguing about like little, livelihood questions, it's a trifle. Okay, so that's sort of introducing the sutra. That's Ananda goes to the Buddha and says, this could be a big problem. How are we going to avoid disputes when you pass away or when you leave in that sense? So this is now going to begin. There's going to be one, two, three, there's going to be four major sections of this sutra. We might get all the way through this tonight. I have no agenda. We're going to see how it goes. I do want you to know the reason why I spent so much time this evening talking about the Vinaya. A sutra like this is as close as we're going to get to the Vinaya in Dharma doors. So this is a very rare sutta. This is a very rare sutra where it's almost a Vinaya text, but it's still a sutra. So, all right. And there's a tremendous amount of wisdom for us. So, Noe, a question before we go further?
Yes. Excuse me. So who would today be practicing the Vinaya? Oh, well, you already said it, but in relation to organizations that are with us today.
Excellent question, Noe. So, on that note, I will let everybody know. Um, so I did my master's thesis was on what it was on was actually the use of the Vinaya and the Pratimoksha, which is an Indian, as you know, this is an Indian-based text, and I was studying the use of the Vinaya and Pratimoksha in China. And basically, I studied, part of my master's thesis was which rules did the Chinese dismiss and which rules did they decide these are the rules. I thought that was interesting to learn what a different culture dismissed and continued. So Noe, your question's really important. Within the world of institutionalized, both monastic and lay, so I want you to know that the Vinaya has lay aspects, but it's primarily for the monastics. And what happens is this, pretty much, and you know, anything I say in Dharma doors is a gross overgeneralization, but pretty much any Buddhist monk or nun, so any ordained monastic anywhere has been ordained by way of a original Indian Vinaya or using the precepts. So the point is, and this was also part of my master's thesis that I won't bore you with, but China, because I studied Chinese Buddhism, China went for several hundred years of like they were learning about Buddhism, but they didn't have a complete Vinaya or Vinaya from India. And eventually they got one. And this was like a very big moment in Chinese history to get a complete Vinaya so that the Chinese could start ordaining people properly, the right way. What happens though, Noe, is you might be familiar with something known as the Bodhisattva precepts. The Bodhisattva precepts are an additional 48, usually it's 48. It's an additional 48 precepts or vows that a Mahayana Buddhist practitioner takes on top of the original old school Vinaya. So whether you're a Theravada monk in Thailand or Laos, Southeast Asia, you've been ordained using a Theravada Vinaya. But then if you are in East Asia, you are also being ordained, but it's going to be a different Vinaya, not a Theravada Vinaya. So this is actually what starts to make different groups of Buddhist, different groups of Buddhist. Most of them are using the same teachings, it's the same Dharma, but they'll have different Vinayas or Vinayas. So it's common for all forms of monastic Buddhism. Yeah, even in Japanese Zen, they're taking Vinaya. Yeah. Great question, Noe. Okay, so the reason why I like to teach this sutra, I've taught this sutra a few times, and the reason why I like to teach it, even though it might seem like it has nothing to do with us because we're not monastic and we're not part of some monastic organization, the reason why I love teaching this sutta is because, for example, our next section, the Buddha says there are, Ananda, 6 roots of dispute. And I like to teach this sutra because the wisdom that we are about to get from the Buddha is for any organization doing anything. So if you are part of an organization or you have been or whatever, this is about maintaining cohesion in a group. So the first thing we are going to do is we're going to talk about the six causes, the six root causes of fighting or dispute. What six, Ananda? Well, here, Ananda, and let me tell you ahead of time how this is going to go. The Buddha is going to give one of these six, and then we're going to get a long paragraph about it. And then we're going to do it with the next one and the next one, the next one, until we hear all six. So we're only doing number one right now. I say this because it might sound like he's throwing a few at us. No, no, no. This is only one. So the first root of dispute is anger and resentment. That's the problem. So here, Ananda, somebody, a bhikkhu, but it could be anybody, somebody is angry and resentful. Such a bhikkhu, such a practitioner, such a person, they dwell disrespectful and undeferential towards the teacher, towards the Dharma, and towards the Sangha. And they do not fulfill the training. A bhikkhu who dwells disrespectful and undeferential towards the teacher, towards the Dharma, and towards the Sangha, and who does not fulfill the training, such a person creates a dispute in the Sangha, which would be for the harm and unhappiness of many, for the loss, harm, and suffering of gods and humans. Now, Ananda, if you see any such root of dispute, meaning anger and resentment, either in yourself or externally, meaning you see it exhibited by somebody else, you should strive to abandon that same evil root of dispute. And if you do not see any such root of dispute, either in yourself or externally, you should practice in such a way that that same evil root of dispute does not erupt in the future. Thus, there is the abandoning of that evil root of dispute. Thus, there is the non-eruption of that evil root of dispute in the future. So, why are there arguments? Why is there not cohesion in a group? Well, one root of that is anger and resentment. Somebody's pissed off, right? And the Buddha is telling Ananda, that being the case, you should look and notice, do you have any anger or resentment? Because if you do, you're part of the problem in that way, or you are a potential part of the problem in that way. So then we get the advice of the Buddha is to look internally and look externally. And the prescription is that if you notice anger and resentment, so if you notice this root of dispute, you should strive to abandon it. And by the way, if you look at yourself and you look around and there's no anger or resentment, you should strive to keep it that way. Now, the language of this should sound familiar. So this is the language of the four right efforts. This was in that list of the 37 aids to awakening. This is an essential part of the practice. I like this sutra because we often hear about this idea of abandoning like evil roots, but it's sort of vague. Now we're getting a very clear, direct description of what they're talking about. They're talking about how anger and resentment causes disputes, and so you should check yourself before you wreck yourself and notice if you have that. And now I want to kind of return to something I was kind of trying to say earlier. Earlier, I was saying that the Dharma, like the the message of Buddhism is kind of simple in a way, that it's this idea of just not arguing, not fighting. So if that's the Dharma, then striving to abandon such behavior is the practice. That's what all we're here to do. So I just kind of want to mention this idea that striving to abandon bad habits, such as getting angry or what have you, that's what we're here to do. That's what we're practicing. And I kind of just want to make it clear that nobody says this is easy. And nobody's just like, yeah, just stop. No, the practice is striving, working on it, working on abandoning that. Everybody feeling okay with? So as we move through these, I would like everybody to think about anger and resentment as a possible culprit in the arising of disputes. Again, I would like everybody to reflect on I would really like everybody to reflect on what we think is to be gained from arguing. That's the real one, is really thinking about like, especially if you can muster the, the wherewithal to notice if you're getting angry and you're ready to start arguing, and really think about what outcome am I really hoping to get out of this argument? And if you were here last week, I would remind you that, the Buddha was saying, you'll never get to nirvana by arguing. That is actually the very way to stay out of a state of nirvana. So we couldn't ever argue ourselves to nirvana in that way. The only way to nirvana is to not argue in that sense. So, okay. So that's the first root, anger and resentment. So again, I'm suggesting everybody think about this as a possible culprit or cause of dispute. And then the Buddha's, or I should say, yeah, the Buddha's suggestion to try to notice if we have it in ourselves in that way. Number two, and I think, yeah, I think for time's sake, I'm not going to go through the whole paragraph each time. I want to remind everybody that Buddhist sutras, of course, are really repetitive that way. And if you were like really studying this sutra, it would behoove you to go through all the repetitions. So, for example, next up, the Buddha says again, Ananda, a bhikkhu, a practitioner, somebody, is contemptuous and insolent. Such a bhikkhu dwells disrespectful and undeferential towards the teacher, Dharma, Sangha, and then it would repeat this entire paragraph regarding being contemptuous and insolent, with the same recommendation that you look at yourself internally, you look around, and notice if you have that tendency, and strive to abandon it if you do. So, contempt, insolence, everybody okay with that? As a young man, I was full of contempt and insolence, I have to say. Yeah, I was like, raging against the machine, I believe is the expression. I don't have quite so much contempt and insolence. I've sort of noticed it as a poison that way, but so that's number two. Number three is enviousness and avarice or jealousy. So envy and jealousy. Another root cause of dispute. Again, I would suggest everybody kind of think about that one and be like, oh yeah, that's a recipe for argument right there. Envy and dispute. And then from a good like Buddhist practitioner point of view, what's up with envy? Like thinking about that, like what's up with envy? Like where's that coming from? And what are we hoping to gain by being envious or jealous in that way? So that's number three. Number four, fraud and deceit. So this isn't about being angry or contemptuous or any of that. This one's about being deceitful, sneaky, fraudulent, things of that nature. Recipe for disaster. Next up, having evil intent and having the wrong view. Now, this language of having the wrong view, this is what we were talking about in the not last sutra, but the sutra before that, that idea of holding to wrong views. I think you can imagine, especially if you were here for that sutra, I think you can imagine that if you are in a group, if you're in a group of people who are really trying to practice this subtle Buddhist idea of like not holding to a view, and like we were all working on that, and somebody was over there just clinging to the wrong view. The idea is that that could be a problem in that way, in that sense. So adhere, having evil intent, having the wrong view, and then the final one, I believe this is the final one. Yeah. Adhering to one's own view, holding on to that view tenaciously, and only relinquishing that view with great difficulty. For me, the way that I understand this, my interpretation of this, if you're in a group and you're the only one that has the view, and the whole rest of the group is sitting there, and if you're sitting there thinking, why don't they see it? You might want to recognize that you're the only one that's holding that view. Now, as a Buddhist recommendation, don't go rushing to adhere to their view if that's the situation where you find yourself alone, but maybe think about not holding on so tightly to your view in the face of contrary views in that way. So on that note, I would really want to highlight that the language of this is this idea of like holding to one's own view, but holding to it tenaciously and refusing to let go of it. So it's not about having your own opinion, your own idea in that way. It's this particular idea of I'm right, you're wrong. That's the mentality that we're looking to avoid. And now, once again, just for good measure, all of those, all six of those, all the way up to holding on to one's view tenaciously and refusing to let it go. Somebody like that dwells disrespectful and undeferential towards the teacher, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And such a person does not fulfill the training. Yeah, not by a long shot. That person creates a dispute in the Sangha, and that would be for the harm and unhappiness of many. That would be for the loss, harm, and suffering of gods and humans. Now, if you see any of those roots of dispute, either in yourself or externally, you should strive to abandon that very same root of evil. And if you don't see any such root of dispute either in yourselves or externally, you should practice in such a way that that same evil root of dispute does not erupt in the future. Thus, there is the abandoning of those evil roots of dispute. Thus, there is the non-eruption of that evil root of dispute in the future. These are the 6 roots of dispute. Everybody okay with all of those? No? Thoughts about any of those?
When you ask the question of, thinking to when you have arguments with someone, maybe especially in groups, but maybe not. The one thing I thought about that I am not seeing on this list, but maybe I'm missing it, maybe it's there, is sort of a self-righteousness, a sort of, which kind of goes along with like not, yeah, it's like a one-upping or a,
Hmm. I would think that's holding to one's view tenaciously.
okay,
Yeah, I would think so.
okay.
Just to, yeah, to put that in the context of the sutra, I think that's, and I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I was thinking about particular view, but that's exactly the same situation with what I'm talking about. Is regardless of the thing, just yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you. That's helpful.
cool. All right. So those are, of course, that's wise sagely advice from the Buddha, right? To look at those six things, notice those as problems for social cohesion. Now we're going to get to a slightly more technical part, but I still think it's interesting. The next part is Ananda. There are these four kinds of litigation. So this is okay. Let's say there is a dispute. Let's say that we do not successfully abandon those six roots of dispute, and let's say there is a dispute. What do we do now? The Buddha says, well, there's four ways to figure it out. So if you're not comfortable with the language of litigation, there's four ways to figure this out. All right. What for? Litigation because of a dispute, litigation because of an accusation, litigation because of an offense, and number four, litigation concerning proceedings. These are the four kinds of litigation. Now, unfortunately, the sutra doesn't say anything more about that. The Vinaya does. The Vinaya says a lot about it, and I do want everybody to know that what we are reading now, what we've been reading, what we are going to read, it matches up entirely with the way the Vinaya functions. It's just the Vinaya goes way deeper into all of this. So those four kinds of litigation, really quickly, because again, it doesn't explain it. Basically, there's four options. One option is litigation because of a dispute. This is if two people just it's a fight, like they're arguing or whatever. And so one thing that can bring about a case, a litigation, is two people arguing, two people fighting. Or number two, there's litigation because of an accusation. We're not fighting, but one of us accuses the other and says, yo, so and so broke the rule. So one is just a straight up fight, the other is an accusation. Number three is it says litigation because of an offense. What that is I'm so glad I mentioned it too. I mentioned that on the new moon and the full moon, the Sangha gets together and recites the Pratimoksha, all the rules. Well, that is the moment for somebody to confess and say, oh, by the way, rule number 200, I broke rule number 200 last week. That is a litigation because somebody has confessed to a wrongdoing. They've confessed to an offense. So now we got to figure it out. So there might be a fight and we got to figure it out. Somebody might accuse somebody and we got to figure it out. Somebody might confess and we got to figure it out. And then the fourth one, litigation concerning proceedings. It's a technical category where it's kind of like litigation about litigation. It's sort of like when we need to get together to talk about the rules themselves. Nobody's broken any rules, but we got to talk about the rules. So those are the four like possible reasons why the Sangha might get together to litigate or to work something out. That makes sense to everybody, those four? Okay. Now, what's about to happen, this is where, Buddha Dharma can get pretty complicated. But now we're going to do the seven ways in which a dispute could resolve itself and be settled. And now this is kind of like a plug and play kind of a thing, because you could have an argument or a dispute, and there's kind of 7 ways that that can get resolved. Or there can be an accusation, and there's 7 ways that gets resolved, if you see what I'm saying. So these are the 7 ways that if there's a problem, it can get worked out. Ananda. There are these 7 kinds of the settlement of litigation. For the settlement and pacification of litigations, whenever they arise, there is the removal of litigation by confrontation. There is the removal of litigation on account of memory. There's the removal of litigation on account of insanity, past insanity. There's the removal of litigation. I have a lot of notes here that are correcting the language, so I almost can't even read the actual text. So I'm just going to read my notes right here. So there's confrontation, and I apologize for the stammering. It's because he actually switches the order when he starts explaining these in a moment. So there's confrontation, memory, insanity, acknowledgement of the offense, the opinion of the majority, a pronouncement of bad character, and then number 7, covering over with grass. Okay, we got that out of the way. We're going to find out what those are, but those are the 7 ways to think about them. So let's go through the first. And how is there a removal of a litigation? So this is, by removal, that means settling. So if you want to use Western legal language. So how is there the settling of litigation, the removal of litigation by confrontation? Well, here, bhikkhus are disputing, people are fighting. This is the Dharma. That's not the Dharma. This is the discipline. That's not the discipline. So those bhikkhus who are arguing about the Dharma and the discipline, those bhikkhus should all meet together in concord. Then, having met together in concord, the guidelines of the Dharma should be drawn out. Once the guidelines of the Dharma have been drawn out, that litigation, that fight, that dispute, should be settled in a way that accords with the Dharma, that we just laid out. Such as the removal or the settling of a litigation by confrontation. And so there comes to be the settlement of some litigations here by removal of litigation by confrontation. Now, this is going to make more sense in a second, because the next one that he's going to talk about is of the opinion of a majority. And he says, if those bhikkhus, meaning the ones we just talked about, that got together in their little group, meaning the people that were arguing for this side and the people that were arguing for that side, they got together, they laid out the Dharma. And so if those bhikkhus do that, but they can't agree, they can't settle that litigation in their little sangha, they should go to a dwelling place where there's a greater number of bhikkhus, where there's a larger number of bhikkhus. There, they should all meet together in concord. Then, having met together, the guidelines of the Dharma should be drawn out. And once the guidelines of the Dharma have been drawn out, that litigation should be settled in a way that accords with it. Such is the opinion of the majority. And so there comes to be the settlement of some litigations by the opinion of a majority. All right, so now we can back up to that first one. And basically what it is that, let's say me and Noam start arguing about what the Dharma means. The idea is that Noam and I would get together with our little Sangha and we would lay out the Dharma. So there would probably be a recitation of the Dharma, something to that effect. And the idea is that ideally, hopefully, what would happen is that after hearing the Dharma laid out, one of us would say, oh, yeah, you're right. You're right. Because what you're saying is in accordance with the Dharma. What I'm saying, I got it wrong. So that would be a settlement or a removal of the litigation by confrontation, right? But it's settled because we looked at the Dharma, we looked at, let's say, all the rules, and it was like, oh, you're right, we aren't supposed to do that. Boom. But then number two is saying, but if that doesn't work out and there's still an argument, Noam and I should then take our argument to a larger group. So, if this were an organization that had like chapters and we couldn't resolve it in our own little chapter, we would have to take it to the next larger group of the organization, would be the idea. And then we would run it back, lay out the Dharma, and hopefully settle it according to the Dharma. Make sense to everybody? Cool. By the way, this is also just fascinating from a historical point of view. Like 2,500-year-old like juridical law or like just like legal theory. It's very interesting if you ask me. Okay, so that's our first two. That's the opinion of the majority. Next up, and how is there a removal or a settling of a litigation on account of memory? On account of sati. So sati is memory, but you usually know it as mindfulness. But the word literally means memory, to remember something. And so, how is a litigation settled because of memory? Well, what happens is that one bhikkhu accuses another bhikkhu of such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat. And they use this language of defeat, which is like, you've made these vows. You have vowed, for example, to be celibate. If you're a monk or a nun, you vowed to be celibate, but you might get defeated. So that's what they mean by a grave offense on the border of defeat. So one bhikkhu accuses another of a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat. And the Sangha, the group, asks, does the Venerable remember having committed such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat? And that person says, I do not, friends. I do not remember having committed such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat. In this case, removal of litigation on account of memory should be pronounced. Such is the removal of litigation on account of memory. And so there comes to be the settlement of some litigations here by the removal of litigation on account of memory. So this is basically innocence. What they're saying is that the person gets accused and the person says, I didn't do that. I don't remember doing that. By the way, if you read the Vinaya, the larger kind of context for this, it might also be that somebody else, like basically is a witness and says, I don't remember them doing that, meaning I didn't see them do that. So the memory part is this idea of like nobody ever being able to remember that this offense even happened. Now, there's something coming up in this, and I think we'll get all the way through this. There's something coming up in this. And what it is I really want us to be kind of aware that in this system, this kind of system of law, if you want to call it that, the Buddhist system here is a system that we would call, in kind of the modern world, we would call this a system of truth and reconciliation. What I mean by that is that there's different, theories of like crime and punishment, basically. And there's an entire theory about the law, and the Buddhists are part of this. And it's the theory that what is actually of the utmost importance is that somebody who's done something wrong acknowledge that it was wrong. Like that's actually more important than punishment and discipline and all of that. In terms of maintaining a kind of an order, maintaining this, having the guilty person acknowledge that what they did was wrong is the utmost importance. I'm saying this because here we might think in our, ultra modern, ultra Western mindset, we might be thinking, well, then you could just lie and say, I didn't do it, and you'd get off. Like you would just be able to walk away free. Yeah, that's a problem if punishment and discipline is your primary interest. We're primarily interested in the truth and reconciliation in that way. This will make more sense in a second. I'm kind of actually like prefacing what's about to happen, but so the third option of settlement is the person was innocent and he doesn't remember doing it. Nobody remembers them doing it. All right. Next up, though, and how is there the removal or the settlement of litigation on account of past insanity? So the insanity plea. Well, here, a bhikkhu accuses or reproves another bhikkhu of such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat. And the Sangha, they ask, does the Venerable One remember having committed such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat? And that person says, I do not, friends. I don't remember having committed such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat. Despite the denial, the former presses the latter. So the person that accused them presses further. Surely the Venerable One must know quite well if he remembers having committed such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat. And the bhikkhu that was being accused says, I had gone mad, friend. I was out of my head, friend. I was out of my mind. And when I was mad, when I was out of my mind, I said and did many things improper for a recluse. I don't remember. I was mad. I was out of my mind when I did it. In this case, removal of litigation on account of past insanity should be pronounced. Such is the removal of litigation on account of past insanity, and so there comes to be the settlement of some litigations here by removal of litigation on account of past insanity. So, again, I wanted you to notice that the most important thing was that the person basically was like, well, I must have been crazy, but if I did that, that was bad. So again, that's like the most important thing in that way. So everybody okay with the insanity plea. Next up, and how is there the, so the language here is, and how is there the affecting of acknowledgement of an offense? This is the removal of litigation based on the acknowledging of the offense. So here, a bhikkhu, whether reproved or not, so whether they've been accused by somebody else or not, such a bhikkhu remembers an offense and then reveals it to the group, reveals it, discloses it to the Sangha. That bhikkhu should then go to a senior bhikkhu, and after arranging his robe on one shoulder, that bhikkhu should pay homage at the feet of the senior bhikkhu. Then, sitting on his heels, so sitting seiza, we would say in Japanese, he should raise his hands, palms pressed together, and say, "Venerable Sir, I have committed such and such an offense. I confess it." The other, the senior bhikkhu says, "Do you see?" And the person says, "Yes, I see." "Will you practice restraint in the future?" "I will practice restraint in the future." Such is the affecting or the removal of a litigation upon the acknowledgement of an offense. And so there comes to be the settlement of some litigations here and now by the affecting or the removal by acknowledgement of an offense. Yeah? So that's like the ideal case in that way, right? Either somebody gets accused or somebody remembers all by themselves, and then it's the act of confession. By the way, I always like to point out, the Buddhists, by the way, seem to have invented the practice of confession and have been practicing confession 500 years before Christianity came along. And by the way, it may very well be the Jesuits that got the practice of confession from the Buddhists in Japan. So there's a long history there that I'm not going to go into tonight. But I just want you to know that this confession is a very big part of Buddhist like law or legal stuff. But we have one more really quickly, one last. And how is there the removal or the pronouncement of bad character against somebody? So this one's funny. Here's what happens. One bhikkhu accuses another of such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat. And then everybody gets together and accuses that person and says, "Does the Venerable One remember having committed such and such a grave offense bordering on defeat?" And that person says, "I don't remember that, friends. I don't remember having committed such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat." Despite the person's denial, the accuser, the former, presses the latter further, saying, "Surely the Venerable One must know quite well if he remembers having committed such and such a grave offense." And the person again says, "I don't remember that, friends. I don't remember having committed such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat." But, friends, I remember having committed such and such a minor offense. Despite the denial, the former presses the latter further, saying, "Surely the Venerable One must know quite well if he remembers having committed such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat." And the person being accused again says, "Friends, when not asked, I acknowledged having committed a minor offense. So when asked, Why shouldn't I acknowledge having committed such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat? He's basically saying, so this person's like, hey, I admitted it. I admitted a minor defense. Why are you asking me again? Right? Why are you asking me again about a grave offense? I just told you I might have committed a minor offense. The other person says, friend, if you had not been asked, you would not have acknowledged committing this minor offense. So why, when asked, would you acknowledge having committed such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat? Surely the Venerable One must know quite well if he remembers having committed such a grave offense. And that person then says, I remember. I remember, friends, having committed such and such a grave offense, one involving defeat or bordering on defeat. I was just joking. I was raving. I was raving when I said that before. I was raving when I said that I don't remember committing such and such a grave offense. Such is the pronouncement of bad character against someone. So that's kind of a funny one where the person's like, well, I don't remember committing a grave offense, but I might have committed a minor one. And then the guy gets accused again. He's like, yo, why are you accusing me of a grave offense? And they're like, well, you just lied to us, right? We asked you and you said you didn't do anything wrong. And then we pressed you further and now you're admitting to a minor defense. You've proven yourself of bad character in that way. So that one, number 7, is like kind of full on Columbo, like the legal drama there in that way. So, okay. Everybody okay? Now we've done the 6 roots of dispute. So the 6 things that can go wrong, the 4 types of litigation, and the 7 ways to bring those litigations to an end. All right. Let's keep going because we have just basically a page left. And it would be a shame at this point actually not to have some good news, some goodness in that way. So, oh, actually, there's the final one, the covering over with grass. I totally forgot about the covering over with grass. I'm going to just simplify that really quickly. The covering over with grass is when, let's say Noam and I, sorry, Noam, let's say Noam and I got into an argument, right? And everybody knew that Noam and I were in an argument. The covering over with grass is when we call a meeting of the Sangha and I stand up and the first thing is I admit that Noam and I got in a fight and fighting is not the Dharma. If fighting is wrong, I acknowledge it was wrong. So quarreling and arguing, I acknowledge it was wrong. Let's just sweep this under the rug. Let's just cover this with grass. If Noam gets up and says, yep, Michael and I were arguing. Arguing is not the Dharma. That is not the way. We shouldn't have been arguing, but I too would like to just, let this go. So if both of us agree to let this go, it's been covered over with grass. So that's like in many ways, one of the better ones in that sense. Okay, so I apologize for that, but that's the last number 7. And now the last part of this, and we have plenty of time. So the last thing the Buddha tells Ananda after the bit about covering over with grass, the Buddha says, Ananda, there are these 6 principles of cordiality that create love and respect, which are conducive to social cohesion, to non-dispute, to concord, and to unity. Those are all just music to my ears, right? All of those. 6 principles of cordiality that create love and respect and are conducive to social cohesion, to non-dispute, to concord and unity. What 6? Here, a bhikkhu maintains bodily karma, bodily acts of loving kindness, both in public and in private, towards one's companions in the holy life. This is a principle of cordiality that creates love and respect and conduces to social cohesion, to non-dispute, concord, and unity. So this is metta, normally translated as loving kindness, being translated as loving kindness here, but I always like to remind everybody that metta means friendliness. It's about being friendly. Loving kindness is a little misleading in that sense, so friendliness, but not just metta. First up is bodily friendliness, bodily metta. So behaving in a way with your body that is friendly or lovingly kind. And I really like this sutra because it points out that the practice is both in public and in private. So don't be, saying like, don't be saying like, oh, nice to meet you. And then they walk away and you're like, no, 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 public and in private. So that's that idea. So that's number 1, metta with the body. Again, a bhikkhu maintains verbal karma, verbal acts of metta or loving kindness or friendliness, both in public and in private, towards one's companions in the holy life. And this too is a principle of cordiality that creates love and respect and is conducive to unity. Again, a bhikkhu maintains mental karma or mental acts of loving kindness or friendliness, both in public and in private towards one's companions in the holy life. This too is a principle of cordiality that creates love and respect and is conducive to unity. Number 4. Again, a bhikkhu enjoys things in common with their virtuous companions in the holy life without making reservations. They share their things with others. They share with them any gain of any kind which accords with the Dharma and has been obtained in a way that accords with the Dharma, including even what has been put in their begging bowl. This too is a principle of cordiality that creates love and respect and is conducive to unity. So, that idea of living in common, using things in common, sharing things in common, that's the 4th principle of cordiality. Number 5. Again, a bhikkhu dwells both in public and in private, possessing in common with their companions in the holy life those virtues that are unbroken, untorn, unblotched, unmolted, liberating, commended by the wise, not misapprehended, and conducive to concentration. This too is a principle of cordiality that creates love and respect and is conducive to unity. If you didn't catch it, this is about we are a sangha, we are working together, and we are living together under the same virtuous precepts. So this idea of like, we have all agreed here to not kill, to not steal, to not lie. We've agreed to that. So that is us sharing in common those virtues that are unbroken, untorn, unblotched, unmolted, and liberating. So one way to maintain social cohesion is for people to be living in a kind of morality together in that sense, living under the same moral code. And then the final one, again, a bhikkhu dwells both in public and in private, possessing in common with their companions in the holy life that view which is noble and emancipating, which leads somebody who practices it in accordance with it to the complete destruction of suffering. This too is a principle of cordiality that creates love and respect and conduces to social cohesion, to non-dispute, to concord, and to unity. So the sixth one is about that we are all working on this noble view, this emancipating view. And the view, if you didn't catch it from all the clues I was dropping, the view is really about not disputing and fighting and arguing. That's really what the teaching is about tonight in that way. So we've learned about sort of what would cause such disputes, how to resolve such disputes, and we learned these six what did he call them? Principles of cordiality that will help maintain that. All right. And just for good measure, the Buddha says these are the six principles of cordiality that create love and respect and are conducive to social cohesion, to non-dispute, to concord, and to unity. If, Ananda, if you undertake and maintain these six principles of cordiality, do you see any course of speech, trivial or gross, that you could not endure? Ananda said, no, venerable sir. Therefore, Ananda, undertake and maintain these six principles of cordiality. That will lead to your welfare and your happiness for a long time. That's what the Blessed One said. The Venerable Ananda was satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. So, on that last little note, so the Buddha says to Ananda, Ananda, if you maintain those six principles of cordiality, could anybody say anything to you that you couldn't just handle in that way? And of course, if Ananda were truly extending loving kindness in body, speech, and mind, and was committed to maintaining the virtue, the marvelous virtue, and maintaining that right view, is there anything that Ananda could not endure? No. That's the idea. Any comments, questions, ideas about the sutta? Any thoughts? Any one of those hyper
Excellent,
practical ones?
Michael.
Yeah, Noe.
Excellent. What a wonderful teaching.
Thank you, Noe. It's a beautiful sutta. Noam, and then Maria.
Just I agree. What a beautiful sutra. And part the part that hit me the hardest was, when you see someone else being whatever it was, stingy, jealous, angry, look at yourself and notice what you're doing. That's like
Yep.
those are words to live by. Thank you,
Indeed,
Michael.
indeed. It's cliche, but I do always like that statement about when you're pointing the finger, remember that there's four more pointing at yourself. Yeah. Maria.
There it is. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to point out that something that I thought was interesting in the list of sort of wrongdoings, contemptuous behavior was listed. And then, so fast forward to the Vajra Sutra, and then there in 16 and 17, there's all this stuff about the one who practices prajna is going to face contempt, utter contempt, and the direction is to bear it because it allows you to exhaust that past karma. And so I just think that's interesting to think about. Maybe if you think about it chronologically or linearly, those, transgressions that came before. Now here's the way to exhaust those. Anyways.
I won't go into the Vajra Sutra tonight, but we will on Tuesday for sure. Yeah, Robin.
Thank you. I've heard of the term where a person would be harmonized. And so do you think this harmonizes with this? We harmonize with a greater universal principles that these things are sort of saying that expand this to where you're almost in harmony then with a truth? It's kind of not sure I can explain it.
As far as I understand what you're saying, Robin, I would actually want to mention on that idea, I would want to mention that the sense that I get from this and other sutras like this, the sense I get is that let's continue to call it harmony. The sense I get is that the idea is that harmony is sort of the natural state, the normal state. And we're doing things or thinking in certain ways that are sort of disrupting that harmony, but it's not a big effort to get to that harmony because it's already the natural state of things, so to speak. And I think that that's helpful to think of it that way, where it's like, oh, I don't have to do anything. If I'm not in harmony, I don't have to do anything. I actually have to look at what I'm doing that's keeping me from being in harmony. And a lot of what we talked about tonight is exactly that. So great question, Robin. Great question. Thanks, Noe. All right. Then on that lovely note of harmony and social cohesion, let's call it a night. So that's Sutta number 104. I will be back next Sunday as usual, and we're going to be moving on to another sutta, probably Sutta 105. I think we'll do that. So I hope you can join us next Sunday night. If you can't, these are always online afterwards. They're on YouTube, so you can always check them out later. Anything from SFDC?
Just happy to have folks here and lovely to have you, Michael. I've been gone for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, we're happy to have you back, Noam.
Yeah, great sutra and looking forward to next week.
Awesome.